The two fields that we're talking about, as far as I can see, because there are two fields at stake, really, right? There is the field of, let's call it rights-based approaches, the whole, all the stuff about how to use human rights in a development practice, and a field of conflict sensitivity or something, whatever we want to call that too, right? These two fields really are born only, as far as I can remember, in the late 1990s, really, mid-1990s, which is actually very, very recently still, if you think about it, right? And there was a reason why they came into being, as far as I know. Which was that there was a sense, quite a widespread sense at that point in time, maybe strongly influenced by the case of Rwanda, but also a whole bunch of other places, of course, that what you could call normal professionalism and the normal right way of doing humanitarian aid or the normal right way of doing development aid seemed to lead sometimes to rather dramatically suboptimal outcomes. Right? It seemed that somewhere we were misunderstanding core social dynamics, and that as a result of that, the impact of our work, even if done well on its own terms, was at the very least unsustainable, as was witnessed by mass conflict, mass violence, mass destruction, but possibly even actually feeding into those very dynamics and so on. And that we didn't seem to understand it very well. That something in our normal professionalism maybe was blind, at least in part, to some of these issues that led to violent conflict that might have had to do with human rights and governance and so on. I think that is a feeling that quite a few people had. I myself for sure had it. And I actually wrote a book about that at the time called Aiding Violence, which is by now already 10 years old. But others did too. And at the time then Mary Anderson started with her work on Do No Harm, which as well was based on the premise that if you don't watch out, even if it wasn't your intention at all, and even if you don't realize it at all, you are having an impact on bigger economic dynamics, social dynamics, political dynamics foremost, power dynamics that you might not necessarily realize, and yet you have it. And that impact can be negative if you don't pay attention. And so out of all this criticism and this thinking, I think grew two new fields really, essentially, right? Or at least grew a sense that change was necessary. A rights-based approach and conflict sensitivity, as I said already earlier, go hand in hand very well, right? A priori, they deal with similar sort of issues. One of the things on the little paper for today that I saw, one of the aims that Maureen mentioned, was to understand this whole business of rights violations as a consequence of violent conflict and as a cause of violent conflict. And evidently that's correct. It's also a total platitude of no use whatsoever, but it is, however, correct. I mean, the reason that I say that it's a platitude is you can't do anything with it, right? Of course it's true, and then, you know, so what? How does it help you to make the real tough decisions? And this is about tough decisions, right? In a post-conflict context, you're always making tough decisions about who you work with and who not, who you give meager resources to and whom not. In a rights-based context, you are also making tough decisions about which rights you're working on and which not. So a post-conflict situation may feel, I think, like a good moment to get something moving on the rights-based front as well. There is maybe some space there suddenly. There is also typically quite a lot of money around, because that's typically what happens after a conflict, especially if the conflict gets solved with a peace agreement or something, and the international community is happy with the whole situation and likes to show its support, and at least for a few years out there, there is dough, lots of it. At the same time, often governments are weak still. Civil societies are maybe not too strong and so on. So, you know, whatever we wish, we can sort of get away with quite a bit maybe. We've taken the use, in any case, during the war already to manage a lot of the show while we were doing the humanitarian aid business. And so we feel like, you know, we know the place, we're ready, we got a vision. So everything seems to be in place to move forward. At the same time, of course, that's not true either. Post-conflict situations or situations of ongoing conflict are extremely tough to make progress on rights-based matters. And I want to discuss that for a moment. I'd like to discuss a number of factors that I was thinking of that are both internal to aid agencies or to aid actors or to development actors and external to them, and that make it hard to make progress on a rights-based approach in a conflict context. So first, let me do the ones inside development organizations. I think I got 4, but I forgot. We'll see. So the first one is that your own staff, or the staff of your partners, but the people involved in doing this sort of stuff may have very different opinions themselves about matters of rights, right? This does not make life very easy, right? Even if a country is not a dictatorial one, and even if one can speak rather freely about matters of rights and be critical and self-critical and so on, it is likely that in a conflict context, these matters are very painful for staff and very divisive even for staff to talk about. When you say the word genocide in Burundi, it means very different things to very different people, right? And right away then there you start diverging. And talking about it is not easy, even though it is possible. Burundi is not a dictatorship where you cannot talk about these issues. Yet it is extremely hard for people to actually do it. And if you can't talk about it as an agency, or if you can't see eye to eye on it, evidently it will be very hard to move forward on it. And post-conflict situations are precisely the sort of times that it's very hard to talk about the very most important things. Okay, point 2. There are many tools out there, right? And we like tools. And we have people who do tools well. And we have conflict assessment tools galore. I'm sure many of you have been trained in them and used them, from precisely Mary Anderson's Do No Harm and many, many others on. Some of you, I'm sure, have a professionally lucrative job doing those tools. So do I, for that matter, at times. And the same holds for the right side. At the right side as well, we have good tools. But recently, I was talking to Diana Chigas, who also works actually for Anderson's outfit, and they had done a big research project in Kosovo, Macedonia? Kosovo, with a whole bunch of organizations looking at the tools they had used and the programming that came out of it. And fascinatingly enough, there was not the faintest relation between the two. i.e., some organizations had really used tools well, smartly, debated well, written good policy papers, and yet their projects in nothing reflected any of this particular knowledge. Other organizations had done nothing and had gorgeously fine-tuned conflict-sensitive projects. There was statistically zero relation between the two. And it would not surprise me if this were the exact same with rights-based tools as well. That there is, as it stands now, almost no relation between the use of the tool and the actual outcome. And they don't necessarily explain how that comes, I think. To them, it's still a question as well. And to me, too. I have evaluated agencies who did nothing and who did a great job, who did nothing in terms of using tools, and yet did a fine job, and vice versa. And so clearly, one of the key challenges inside our organizations must be something about what do you do with knowledge, right? How do you get knowledge to stick and to be operationally relevant to yourself? And I imagine that this may be also one of the topics on the table for the next couple of days, because it's not solved. Number 3, what does that one say? Yeah, I think that there are some major limitations in the rights-based approaches themselves, which are particularly severely felt in a post-conflict context. For example, one of the things that is really bothersome about rights-based approaches and human rights advocates in general, apart from their painfully obnoxious high moral ground, is their incapacity to deal with issues of resources, right? It is as if resource constraints never exist. It's only political will. If things happen, if rights are violated, it must be evil people in power who make this happen, right? And hence these evil people in power must be told what to do right, because of course, being evil and stupid most of the time, I guess simultaneously, they need to be forced into this. But the fact that there might be resource constraints that are real, that the knowledge and the people and the money really isn't out there to make many of these things happen, and that hence these things happen for a reason, potentially, at least in part, is very hard to deal with from a rights perspective. It's actually basically impossible to deal with from a rights perspective, because it would mean that you would have to start trading them off or making choices about which ones to kind of drop for the moment. But it is clear that, to take Burundi again, even if we had in power a government that was solely and exclusively committed, morning to night, about making rights happen for people, both political and economic, ones, and economic and social ones, even if the government wanted to do that. And admittedly, it doesn't. But even if it did, it could not. There is no possible way it could even make one single one entirely happen for its full population as it stands. The right to food. How exactly would we make it happen in Burundi right now, tomorrow, or even in a year? Or the right to education for all? So resource constraints do exist. And as development people, we're quite good with it. And as policymakers too. But rights people have a hard time facing up to that reality. And in a post-conflict context, when the resource constraints are typically enormous and the needs are enormous, that leads to a sort of lack of legitimacy, I think, of talking about rights in the usual way. It makes rights people sound stupid or naive or simply indeed about high moral ground and nothing else. Governments typically don't appreciate work on rights-based approaches in post-conflict contexts. They might not have appreciated it before either, or during, but they surely don't do it actually afterwards either. I have never seen one that liked it. You know, and again, even if they're not outright totalitarian governments or highly authoritarian governments, they just don't particularly like it. They want to have some time off without being criticized right away for things that they often consider that they are not really responsible for. They are formal rebels often, or formal, who really are not exactly champions of human rights, and that's not particularly the tool that brought them to power either. So it would be unlikely that suddenly overnight this becomes their prime concern. They often feel strongly that security is more important concern than rights in the short term, and that strengthening their own control and power over the territory is the most important constraint. After all, the fact that there was a violent conflict precisely meant that there was not a clear full control over the territory. And so to most of them, having full control and establishing that for sure is absolutely primordial. They are often suspicious, if not outright paranoid, about much outside criticism and so on. And so in that particular context, to start talking about rights-based approaches is almost guaranteed to lead to strong backlashes. Rwanda would be, of course, a perfect example thereof, but I think most situations are like that. So while on the one hand there is a space there, on the other hand there is often violent counter-reaction from the powers that be, and you risk creating quite a lot of trouble for yourself, which often is not something you particularly desire. Many of the people who locally talk about rights have deep political agendas, which we often don't understand very well. Again, let me give a little example from Burundi. For example, this is a funny one. There is a Conseil National de Bashingantahe out there, a national council of old, wise, traditional power holders, supposedly. And this is neat stuff. Old wise men do conflict resolution. They were men, I'm sorry. They do conflict resolution type of stuff. They do, which is on the border of justice, potentially rights even, and on the border clearly of conflict resolution and so on as well. And we like that sort of stuff. So a national council gets created. Some lady at UNDP with $1 million to give away gives that $1 million away to the leader of that national council. But of course, if you start looking more closely, very often you see that such agencies, who, by the way, write beautiful reports, absolutely gorgeous, beautiful, highly critical of the government, pointing out very correctly rights abuses by the government. But this is a very, very deeply political affair. This particular man has a major political agenda, has a long-standing opposition to this government, had long-standing deep relations to the previous governments, now discredited and out of power, and so on. And so we outsiders, in our desire to hook up with local forces for change and dynamics, and even in this case, something traditional, which is even more progressive, of course, isn't it? Even more beautiful. We get stuck in very, very nasty little games often that we don't realize. To us, it's a beautiful terminology, right? Often to other people, it's a tool in a political battle, which is logical. But it doesn't make it any easier, of course, to talk about rights or to work on rights. Yeah, the human rights approach is de facto very state-oriented, right? Certainly, human rights as a sort of legal edifice and a scholarly field is extremely legally oriented and extremely state-oriented, right? The state is the locus where rights ought to be guaranteed, right? The state is in charge of legislating and organizing. But evidently, in a post-conflict situation, it is a very partial look right away. i.e. the violation of a right may occur somewhere and may not be the state. It may indeed be, say, men to women or parents to children. But the duty bearer in international law and in human rights law is the state. It is up to the state to create the legal or other conditions to eradicate this particular violation. And this makes entire sense from a legal perspective. But I do not think that it is a perfect solution from a perspective of where you sit, most of you, as development practitioners. I think that there are many things within society that one can do and partners to work with and so on, and that an exclusive focus only on it's the state's job, because it is the duty bearer, to solve rights violation is a mistake. In post-conflict situations where clearly there is very violent tensions often still alive underneath between the state and at least part of the opposition and society, that is not a very helpful situation. That is clearly something that has been happening in Rwanda, for example, where many of us got stuck into anti-state attitude, and we got stuck in it, we got tied up in it. I remember people telling me when I would go there, Peter, the only civil society in Rwanda is, and then they would name 3 names or 3 organizations, and the only thing those 3 had in common is that they were radically opposed to the government. But wait a minute, is that the only thing that makes you a civil society, to be radically opposed to the government? But we got stuck into that because as a rights-based person, we see violations in the state only, and hence those who are opposed to the state and point out very loudly those violations become our preferred partners very often. But evidently that is a big mistake to make. And it will hurt you, as it did in Rwanda, where everybody failed with that strategy. So those are some of the difficulties, I think, of doing a rights-based work in a post-conflict context. Clearly there are many of them, which makes one wonder, is it überhaupt possible to do this? And I think it is possible, but I also think I ran out of time. So I think some of these issues may well come up later in the conversation. And first, let's see if there are any questions. Do we still have time for questions?
I think the key question is related with the capacity of the government. The main issue is that a government may have a limited capacity to deliver. And sometimes in a situation of conflict, if you do the capacity of building of government or work with the government, then this question of providing legitimacy to many of the authoritarian governments may arise there. So there is a dilemma here. Whether you provide some assistance to a government which politically can be seen as legitimizing the regime. And if you don't do that, then the poor people in the communities may not be getting anything. I think that's one dilemma. The second is clearly seeing the difference between the right-based approach and need-based approach. I think the same things, many of the things can be done in either ways. I think the key difference will be that if we do the need-based approach, sometimes we may be reinforcing the existing power relationships there. I think the right-based comes there when we do something, we try to fulfill the needs, but as well as try to change the existing power relations. Thank you.
What we state to be the aim of post-conflict situations reconstruction, usually we say it's a return to normalcy. But what was normalcy? And that's the issue for me. What was normalcy just before the conflict? Normalcy was also a situation where rights were being abused. Normalcy was a situation where power relations encouraged the exclusion of others. And so we return to normalcy, therefore return to a foundation for a new conflict or a new crisis. And I ask myself that, and then when you pose the question of power, oftentimes we change the face of power without changing the nature of power. So it may be new people, new regimes, new old rebels, but the nature of power remains the same. And because the nature of power is oppressive and exclusionary, it continues to perpetrate the causes of conflict.